are really happy to be here. My name is Jessica Burton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. We are an organization based here in Maine that is committed to strengthening the various conservation organizations working in York and Cumberland County through technical assistance, through shared resources and training, and through strategic partnerships both within the network and beyond the network. And that's what this sustainability series represents, is our partnership with the Portland Public Library has led to this amazing series. This is the fourth in our speakers. We had a conservation filmmaker begin in August. In September, we had scientists speak about the impact of oil spills on a warming Arctic Ocean. Our last presentation, which was in October, was from the Portland Water District about their program conserving land in the watershed as a way to reduce costs related to cleaning water for us to drink. Next month, we will have a speaker from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute to talk about the sea level rise, and then we'll continue to have the series. The fourth Wednesday, the fourth Wednesday of every month, so the 28th of December is the next one, and then January, February. In February, we are having a speaker, Paul Mayowski, who is a professor at Bangor, who actually today spoke on Maine Calling, I think, or yesterday, and he will speak about the impacts of climate change. He's a world-renowned scientist. So tonight, we are excited to invite you all to stay a little longer than 7. We have some food, some cookies, and cider to share. And the library is very graciously said we could stay until 7:30. Normally we have to leave at 7, but we can continue our conversation after this, what I know will be a very intriguing presentation. So we're thrilled to have Kent Redford present with us tonight. Kent is a principal at Archipelago Consulting based here in Portland, and it's an organization and consulting firm designed to help individuals and organizations improve their practice of conservation. And he, previous to this, has worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Nature Conservancy, and for 10 years he was a faculty member of the University of Florida. He received his PhD in biology from Harvard and has written numerous articles and books on synthetic biology and conservation, national parks, local peoples, conservation, and wildlife. And he's a really fun guy. We're thrilled. Thank you.
You'll have the chance to assess the fun part yourselves over the next while. So first, what I want to do is show you a vegetable that you're all perhaps overly familiar with at this time of year in Portland. It's a piece of kale from the last of the farmers markets out here. And I want to show you this because it's an accessible way of talking about what's a really difficult topic. But I want to show you this kale because it personifies, if you think of plants as being people, the kinds of developments that I want to talk about today. So this is a slide that's about telling you why we're headed on this journey that I want to take you on. This is the Science magazine, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals, from 14th November. And there are 2 articles in this. And this is the one in particular I want you to talk about. This is an article that showed that in the laboratory, using a tobacco plant as a model organism, they were able to actually change the physical properties, the chemical properties of photosynthesis, and increase by 20% the effectiveness with which light was gathered and turned into sugar by a plant. In the same article, same issue, was an article which was a way of showing you that they can do photosynthesis without plants and without even the chemical structure and pathway that's used in plants. It is these technologies and their applications that I want to talk to you about today. So that's where we're headed. I want to give you that heads up. You're thinking about a kale that's 20% larger or more effective or more nutritious with these kinds of technologies, and what that's going to mean for conservation. That's where we're headed. So I'm going to back off and I'm going to show you my own journey for how I got to this topic. So I was raised at a time when nature and being outside in forest was regarded as an entrancing thing that kids should do, loving frogs, but it was separate than being a human. And we as humans, as being responsible people on this earth, wanted to conserve nature from destruction. And the destruction we had in mind was destruction by people. Because we all knew at this time that humans were bad for nature, and that in order to save nature, you needed to remove people. So this was the trajectory, the education that I had. And that once you remove people, you see, nature would thrive without human interference. And that was generally the view, that management of nature, instead of being management, in fact meant no management. Again, this is my education as we went through this. And it was when I was in my late 20s and early 30s that I realized that I had an entirely incorrect worldview about how things operated when I was younger, but certainly as I've gotten older. And in fact, humans and nature are intertwined in virtually inextricable ways. I want to give you just a few examples of these. So these are square watermelon, or cube watermelon, and they were developed because the Japanese only like small refrigerators. And so you can't fit a round or globular watermelon effectively in a small refrigerator, so no Japanese were buying watermelons. So they actually figured out a way to grow watermelons in glass boxes in order so they would fit effectively in Japanese refrigerators. Or this example, this fine bird is a lyrebird, and they are very talented vocalists and vocal mimics. And in the part of their home range, part of where they live in Papua New Guinea, they now have copied the sound of chainsaws as part of their song. And so when they're singing to one another, they're actually included a stanza about the very destruction of their own habitat. Or these extraordinary photographs that come from Christmas Island. An inadequate number of shells has resulted and the abundance of plastic trash that we see on all our beaches has resulted in hermit crabs that have simply made homes out of this plastic bottle lid. Or this example that comes from Europe. This is a fine little bird called the great tit, and this is a sonogram. So this is a physical depiction of the song of a great tit out in the countryside. So it's a tweet, 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 tweet at these levels. So here is what a great tit tries to do when singing in the city or in a town. All of this is background noise from humans, traffic, televisions, radios, what have you. And the birds have actually had to raise the pitch of their song in order to be actually heard one to the other in the urban settings. And you know, it takes the form of when trying to raise panda babies in captivity, you are not able to, you have to simulate the mother by dressing in panda costumes. And then perhaps my favorite example, there are people who are part of a culture known as furries, who believe that they should not have been born as humans, but should have been born as animals. And there are furry conventions at which people dress up and do their furry things. And the great thing about this is the cheater in this, who shows up as a star trooper. And you can only imagine what happens in a furry convention with a star trooper. So the point is that these are lesser examples. These are a way of trying to ease you into thinking about these interconnections between humans and the natural world. And it takes place in some fundamental ways as well. So this is a flooded grassland area where I used to work in lowland Bolivia. And at the time when I was working there, we did work on these forest islands, and you just thought of them as forest islands. The ground was slightly higher, and so the trees were able to get their feet out of the water that was here in the grasslands. And in fact, it was after I had left that an archaeologist did work and showed that those islands are composed almost entirely of the remnants of previous human civilizations, broken up pots, soils that were enriched by human excrement, etc. So that island isn't there, in fact, because of the human activities that were there. And this inextricable relationship between human action and the natural world is shown in a variety of different ways. So this is we'll get to this, but if you look at all of the species that are listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, over 80% of them, in order to survive, are going to require perpetual human management. That is, if we wish to keep 82% of our endangered species, we will never be able to stop managing. So managing, what does that mean? So this is Kirkland's warbler, fine little migratory bird, and it nests in the upper portions of Michigan and into southern Canada. And it requires jack pines that are about this high in order to nest. But those jack pines are fire dependent. We have removed the fire, and the trees have grown up to be too large for these birds to nest. So what have we done? Every year, 2,000 acres of jack pine forest are raised and replanted. These are replanted young jack pines so that the birds will find adequate nesting habitat. And then, of course, these trees grow up, and then they'll be cut down. And we are in this forever if we wish to keep Kirkland's warbler. Of course, a topic on everybody's mind is the extent to which climate change is affecting all of this. And this is not a talk about climate change. We can go into that in discussions if you want. But there is no doubt that the nature of human impact on the natural world is only increased if you think about the ways climate interacts with species and ecologies. And this sort of ironic but very New York photograph is from the New York Aquarium post-Hurricane Sandy, where the saltwater fish in the saltwater aquarium are looking at the saltwater ocean, which has invaded the aquarium itself. So recapping, see, I was raised with this simple dichotomy illustrated here, where people are bad, so you have this destroyed rainforest, and nature is good. And this has, the understanding of this has become so solidified that the proposal, as put here on the Economist magazine, is that we are now in the Anthropocene, which is the geological epoch in which humans have become the major evolutionary and geological actors. In fact, the calculation has been shown that humans have moved more Earth than all of the rivers in the last 1,000 years. So we are a geological force. So in fact, as you realize this, and as my own learning comes along through this process, you realize that in fact we live in this hybrid world where these interactions between nature and humans are perpetual. And that results in a set of hybrid practices in conservation. So this is an extraordinary place in Oosterveld, Netherlands, which is land that was reclaimed from the ocean to start with. And it has been planted in grasses, and these animals have been loosed there to behave the way that we think that animals used to behave before humans were in Europe. And there used to be wild horses that are extinct, so they have found a breed of horses that they are now letting live as wild horses in this ecosystem. These are red deer, or elk. And they're starting to try to recreate this on land that used to be at the bottom of the ocean. Or this, which is one of my favorite examples, for those of you who are natural historians, you will immediately see a problem in this image right here. The problem is that this is a tiger, which is an Asian animal, and that is a South African antelope. So the reason that South African antelope had this unfortunate encounter with a South China tiger is that South China tigers are extinct in China, but they live in zoos. And there are a set of extremely optimistic people who intend to try to change southern China so tigers can live in it. So in the meanwhile, they are taking South China tigers, and they bought a private game ranch in South Africa and are training captive cubs to kill, so they'll be ready when the time comes to be able to allow to be turned back into China. So there are places in this world now, and many of them are more urban, but not all of them, in which we have what are the term of art being novel ecosystems. These are places where species and ecological processes in combinations that have never naturally occurred on Earth are taking place because humans have moved these species around, and they're creating their own new ecologies. And we are taking a very active part in these kinds of restoration or conservation endeavors. So these are coral reefs, in parentheses, in quotes. They are 3D printed. So these are modeled after the underlying matrix of coral reefs. And they are produced by a 3D printer and then bolted out into the ocean, and they prove to be very amenable for the settlement of coral reef larvae, plants, and animals. So that the coral reef then grows on top of these, and you're left with this hybrid of a coral reef. So just to reiterate, because you'll see why it's so important, we have become commingled with the natural world, making it hard to know exactly what it is that is natural when we consider about wanting to conserve nature. Now, in the field, in the discipline, the big argument recently, and picking up from the past, is between whether you're in favor of biocentric conservation, that is, conservation for the sake of nature, or whether you are in favor of anthropocentric conservation, that is, preserving things so that humans are able to exploit them. And the point I want to make to you today is that that is an insufficient way of thinking about this world that we now inhabit, and that we have a dimension which is not on that line, but actually extends down here and can be extended in either way, which is a novel operating space for conservation, that we are moving into a place where this no longer makes sense. The kinds of decisions that we are going to face are the ones that I want to talk to you about now. And here we get to the sort of kale background. What goes on, the reason we need to have that extra dimension is the development of this field called synthetic biology. And we're going to talk most of the rest of the talk about synthetic biology. Now, what does that mean? The tagline is biology is technology, and this fine book written by a colleague has that title. That's really the point. Engineers have discovered biology, and they are dissatisfied with what they find, and they intend to change it the way engineers do. Now, how are they doing that? So, and there are a couple of wordy slides here, but just work with me here. So synthetic biology uses new science and engineering, these are the point here, to design, modify, and manufacture novel forms of life to produce goods for human purposes. This is done through, you can read DNA and then create a digital version of it. You then modify the DNA digitally, not physically, but digitally. And then you send that digitally modified DNA to a machine that actually makes real DNA. You then take that real DNA and you put it into an empty cell, reboot the cell, and that's the language the engineers use, so that now functioning cell is going to do what you have told it to do, not what, if you don't mind the phrase, God intended it to do. And underlying this is the engineering love of modularity. So the people working in this field create units of DNA, promoters, transcription factors, start, stop, repeat, and you can go onto the internet now, if you wish, with your credit card, and you can buy all of these things, amplifiers, toggle switches, degradation tags, oscillators, and you can assemble, if you were a good engineer, you could assemble the DNA using these pieces that are available to anybody who wants to buy them on the internet. This technology has been ramped up to an extraordinary fashion with the creation of this new technology that, if any of you read anything about this, you have seen a lot in the last year, which is CRISPR technologies. Now, no point in going into the details. The point is that this is an incredibly accurate and precise technology that allows you to silence, enhance, or change individual genes on a genome. And just in case you didn't think that was enough, so this study was done last year, and to me it's particularly interesting for the kinds of opportunities that engineers are looking for. So normally there are, if you remember your biology, there are 4 nucleotides that make up DNA. So they are A, T, C, and G, and all DNA consists of different combinations of the A, T, C, and G until now. Why? Because these scientists have inserted 2 different nucleotides, X and Y, into DNA, which are replicated the way DNA works, but they're unprogrammed. They're not doing anything yet. So that is a space, a blank space in DNA that will allow engineers to code for actions that are not taking place. A pretty amazing thing to do with DNA. Now, it's not just in certain labs that we're talking about. And I want to make the point about the inevitable nature of this technology. So this is 2013, and this shows you the major centers of activity all around the world. That's the point. And by the way, that big pulsing red thing is Boston. So in case you thought you were safe in Portland, don't let the Concord coach bus arrive back from Boston. And economically significant. So products that are produced using these technologies in 2012 represented $324 billion in the US economy. And that was 4 years ago. And most of that was in crops, genetically modified crops, industrial chemicals, and biologics, the kinds of things that are used as the basis for industrial manufacture. So, is this all about little stuff? Well, no. It's about big stuff. So the Gates Foundation is funding an attempt to change rice, to change the photosynthesis in rice from a less efficient C3 photosynthesis to C4. Now, the point is that there are two different kinds of photosynthesis that you find out there amongst plants. And one of them is much better at turning light into sugar than the other one. And rice has the inefficient one. So they are attempting to change rice. And if they succeed and that rice is planted, you're going to look at a 50% greater yield in rice on existing rice fields. Half the water, half the fertilizer, and a greater ability to respond to climate change. So, we're talking about the major food for the largest, the most important staple food in the entire world being changed through these technologies if it works. And we've already talked about this hacking photosynthesis. So there you go with the engineering view. We no longer need plants in order to conduct photosynthesis. That's the point. It can now be conducted, at least in a lab level, independent of plants themselves. So it's not all about plants either. This is a list of all the animals in which these technologies, well, some plants down here, but most of these are animals in which these CRISPR technologies, very precise changes have already taken place. And I want to just give you examples from these two, pigs and dogs. So you may know that tens of thousands of people a year die from a lack of organs. They have failed hearts or failed livers, and there are an insufficient number of them in order to keep people alive. You may not know that the anatomy of pigs is actually very similar to human anatomy. And there has been work that has successfully moved pig organs into humans. The problem is that pigs have these things called porcine endogenous viruses. Anyway, the point is that there are 36 of these genetically based, and that human body rejects the organ because of the presence of these. George Church at Harvard University successfully eliminated all of these porcine retroviruses in pigs, leaving open the potential that we're going to be able to get rid of the problem of organ transplants, except that we're going to have 10,000 people a year who are going to be living with pig organs inside them. But they're going to be living. Now, and just because you need a little lighter touch, so the Chinese, using these same technologies, have created these two beagles, which have twice the muscle mass of ordinary beagles. They found the genetic sequence that codes for muscle mass. And these, I think one of them is called Hercules. When you see them when they're bigger, they're just, they look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his youth as a beagle. The point isn't that you can get these hyped up beagles to beat anybody else's beagle at the CrossFit gym, but that people are going to be able to customize their pets now, if not themselves, through the use of these technologies. So, and this also isn't just a high-tech thing that you'll find only in expensive university or industrial labs. There has been an active push to democratize this science through the creation of this set of public labs. And this is 2 or 3 years old now, but these are all public labs. You can go in and pay a fee, and you have access to almost the cutting edge machinery that is used in labs that you can use as a member of the public coming in from the sidewalk. You can buy your DNA, get it there, go to your public lab, pay your fee, and start to do what you want to do. And if you didn't want to go to the lab, this is now a Kickstarter campaign. This machine is all you need to create, to modify bacterial cells. You create your own medicinal chemical scents and foodstuffs. $800 and the price expected to go down. So all around the world, not just in expensive labs, and in case you weren't worried yet, there is a fabulous competition called iGEM, which is a competition. It just took place in October in Boston. Another reason not to have the bus line connecting us. So 2015, this is the last year's number, 239 teams, 39 countries, and 34 of those teams are high school students. So you have high school students who have learned the technologies of making novel life forms. So you can just imagine, so this is pushing up from a younger generation, which is going to think of this as quite an ordinary thing to do. Now, all of that has been done virtually without any concern for the natural world. And here you see the pivot back to the question of conservation. So alarmed by this, over the last several years, I and some colleagues have been involved in trying to get together the communities of synthetic biologists and the conservation communities. And so these are the results of some of these conversations. Potential ways in which these technologies could be applied to the natural world. This has drawn the attention of journalists in a really kind of bizarre bijou fashion, which is de-extinction. And there is a project now. This is a passenger pigeon, which used to be the most numerous bird probably in the world. There were billions of them in North America, and we drove them extinct. But there's now a project to re-establish passenger pigeons, and the objective is a free-flying flock of 10,000 birds in the northeastern North America. And this is a person that gives you an idea of the size of these trees. These fabulous trees were chestnut trees, American chestnut, which were one of the most important canopy trees through the entire eastern, particularly the southeastern portion of what's now the United States. 1904, a virus coming from China was first detected at the Bronx Zoo. Within 30 or 40 years, all these trees were dead. And then the virus persists. It allows trees to grow to a small size, but never to grow large enough to reproduce. Using these technologies, these trees are now, and the genes from wheat, we now have chestnuts, which are American chestnuts, which are immune to the virus. So we may have 10,000 free-flying restored passenger pigeons, because they're not completely passenger pigeon, eating chestnuts from these modified chestnut trees. Whether you think that's a good idea or not is part of the question that we're going to need to be asking ourselves. So these technologies are also starting to apply to restore lost genetic diversity. So this find in the land mouse, a black-footed ferret. It lives obligately in prairie dog burrows, and it eats prairie dogs. The number was reduced to fewer than 25 animals. So it went through a genetic bottleneck. There are stored frozen cells from animals which never produced babies, so their genetic complement is not represented in the population. These technologies are going to allow the reinsertion of that lost diversity back into the breeding population. Hawaii had no mosquitoes prior to 18-something or other, when the first mosquitoes arrived in the water barrels of whaling ships. It now has 6 species of mosquitoes. 2 of those species are particularly effective in carrying malaria, avian malaria, bird malaria, which is the second major factor responsible for the extinction of almost 45% of the native Hawaiian forest birds. So the mosquitoes bite, the bird transmits the malaria then kills the bird. So there is a proposal now in Hawaii to use these technologies to eliminate all 6 species from all Hawaiian islands. Not clear whether it completely be done, but that's what's being talked about. Even more interesting is a proposal to actually use these tools to change the genes, to turn on a set of genes in some corals that will allow them to tolerate warmer ocean temperatures. And to me, there are a couple of these other things which are not strictly conservation related, but have huge implications for conservation. This is a map. If you look at the red, these are what are considered to be highly degraded soils, but basically they're no good for agriculture or for the nature to grow. And they have largely been abandoned. There is the potential to use these technologies to modify plants to reintegrate what amounts to almost 10% of the Earth's surface back into productive uses, if that were to work. Or, in a similar fashion for fresh waters, even though these numbers are dated, it just boggles my mind. 2009, legally we have released 271 million pounds of pharmaceuticals into our freshwater systems in 2009. And almost all of those chemicals are not picked up and removed from the water by water treatment plants. These technologies can be used to alter the bacteria in these water treatment plants to remove these things which pass through us down the toilet and out into the streams. We have a particular problem in many parts of the world with invasive species, both animals and plants. Some of you may know about the problem with Burmese pythons in the Everglades. Rats and mice are particularly problematic, and I want to focus on the mice part. So these are ocean islands where the mice are actually quite aggressive predators on the chicks of seabirds. And this is a technology which will, if you deploy it, it results in all male offspring. So you would introduce a set of mice that contained this genetic change, and you would end up not having to kill a single mouse. And the last two gay male mice would die, and there would be no more mice left. These are called gene drives that force those modifications into the population. Now, you have to be very careful with this, because if you were in a country where house mice, in fact, are native species, you would run the risk of actually losing your native species. Now, one of the things that's not talked about so much, but is one of close to my heart, my stomach, is you may all be familiar with the notion of a microbiome. So if you look at yourself in the mirror, looking back at you are more non-human cells than human cells. You've got 500 species that live in your mouth. They live throughout your alimentary tract, on your skin, in your hair, and your nose, everywhere, all these bacteria. And it may be possible that by modifying the microorganisms associated with higher vertebrates or plants, you may actually be able to achieve some things that have not previously been possible. Now, so that's the upside. That's the sort of optimistic view. When you have this conversation with people, including myself, you end up with people say, whoa, but wait a minute, what about? So here is a set of the what about slides. And this drawing is courtesy of my son, who has not changed his style since he was in elementary school. But one of them is, there's a big conversation that goes on right now which says the reason we need to save natural systems is that they produce goods and services that humans need. This is the sort of payment for ecosystem services. So what would happen if we could engineer species to produce that service at a greater, faster, higher rate for lower cost than the natural world would? Well, you know, if we're giving ourselves over to the economy and the economic logic in the world, you would simply say, well, so cut all that native forest, and how about planting these? So these are poplars that were grown in experimental fields at Oregon State University, which actually sequester carbon at much higher rates than natural poplars would. So if you want trees to sequester carbon, fine, I'll give you them, I'll sell them to you, and we'll be able to achieve that. Perhaps for me, the most profound of the worries is that if you produce these live organisms with these modifications, they are not going to stay the same way because natural selection and evolution is going to start affecting those changes in ways that we really, really cannot predict. Or if you're more of a concern about the capitalist world, you might worry about the privatization of this. This is the number of patents in this field. So it won't surprise you that almost everything that we've talked about, not all of it, but a good portion of it is patented. So here's a thought exercise. I have produced this incredibly genetically diverse black-footed ferret, which is going to help save black-footed ferrets, except I own that black-footed ferret. It's an endangered species that I own. We just don't know. We don't have a regulatory framework for knowing how we would deal with that. Or you might say, okay, fine. So you're going to be able to do all this. Where are you going to grow the organisms that are going to produce these things to help save the world? So these things are called algal raceways. So this is where algae is produced in commercial quantities. And this is for nutritional purposes. So it's not a synthetic biology issue. But this is the kind of facility you would need if you needed industrial-sized versions of that. And notice where it is in relationship to, to critical marine habitat. So the background slide is of oil palm plantations. And those of you who follow that know that the increasing number of hectares converted of natural habitat to oil palm plantations are arguably one of the most important reasons for tropical deforestation now. That's a problem. Aha! Here comes a solution. One of these algal cells has been engineered that produces a higher chemical quality palm oil than comes from the plant itself. Hallelujah, this won't happen. Okay, where are you going to grow that plant, that algal cell that produces all that oil? Is it simply going to be a case of ripping out the oil palms themselves and putting in algal raceways? And what? And we gained out of that? So these are the kinds of things that we just don't know about yet. And of course, that conversation leads us to, there's a very strident and strongly held set of people who think that the major problem with these new technologies is going to be the impact that they have on the rural poor. You can argue that either way. Nonetheless, it's an argument, it's a concern that is deeply felt. Now, I want to just give you a few of the kinds of technologies that have actually been launched that are relevant to us here that I want to talk about. So methane, is a major greenhouse gas, and much of it is flared off or burned off. Well, these folks have found a way. They've converted bacteria so that they now will feed on methane. They are eating methane, and then they are producing protein, which is harvestable to be turned into food to be fed to aquaculture fish. So you have decreased the greenhouse gas. You have alleviated the harvesting of wild fish to feed the farmed fish, and you have I lost something else there. But you have an apparent win-win, if not win-win-win situation out of these. Or from almost a more human rights sense, this is a plant which has been modified to respond to the presence of trinitrotoluene in the soil, which is TNT. So this plant changes color when its roots encounter those chemicals in the soil. So you can imagine this kind of technology being used to locate landmines. As you know, unexploded ordnance is a huge problem, particularly thanks to the US government in Laos and Cambodia. So you could see, potentially, that you could use a drone to spread these seeds and simply watch the way the plants grew, and then identify the sites of the unexploded ordnances as a result of that. Then the last example is, I find particularly, impressive. So you may not know this plant by sight, but you know it by function. This is canola, or rapeseed, major source of vegetable oils. You also know about omega-3 fatty acids have become very popular, and a lot of interest in nutritionists about the role that they play in human physiology. We, in fact, if you want to hear a pathetic story, it would be me trying to learn how to fly fish from a guide out here off the Maine coast entirely unsuccessfully, but the point is that there were 4 different vessels, all of which were fishing for fish right here in Casco Bay that were being harvested specifically for long-chain fatty acids, these omega-3 acids. The fish themselves don't make it. It actually is from a marine microorganism. So this Australian group, along with Dow Chemical, has removed the genetic sequence from that marine organism and put it into canola. So we are anticipating very soon the commercial production of canola oil that will provide significant dietary levels of omega-3 fatty acids, meaning that that fishery is no longer necessary. So, you know, all of this, whether you like it or not, is taking place in a world that is really not doing very well across many fronts. The topic for us today is on the natural front. So this is a polluted river in China. And under these circumstances, we have an even greater responsibility because our actions are not only directed at ourselves, but are having this knock-on or direct impact on the natural world. And we have to engage, I would put to you, in an even greater and with even greater responsibility towards our task, our responsibility to manage the world. Yet we are particularly inept at imagining the kind of disruption that these new technologies may produce for us. So in agriculture, for example, I gave you a couple of examples like rice. Well, so here's an example where the genes of sugarcane have been changed, so it's now no longer has to be a tropical plant. Or how about this? Close to market, perfect day, animal-free milk. This is milk from cow cells that never saw a cow. Headed our way. Or this fine young lady, Layla Richards, when she was 2, she was diagnosed with infantile leukemia, and all known attempts to allow her to live failed. The parents gave the doctors okay to try this radical CRISPR surgery to actually, because they identified the genes that were responsible for the particular childhood leukemia she had, they turned off those genes. And Layla, to the best of my knowledge, is now a thriving girl. This is the kind of example, and the reason I use this is the child whose life was saved that is going to make it very difficult to see these kinds of technologies advance. And the disruption in conservation, the examples I've given you, that's the kind of thing that just hurts my head when I try to think about whether they're good or bad, whether they should be used or not. But what I want to jump now abruptly to where we are now. I think, I've spent 30 years in the field of conservation, so these are my people. We are a depressive group of people. We believe that by telling you that the world is going to hell even faster than you thought, that you're going to change your behavior because I'm now yelling at you. So this is what gets produced. 100 animals to see before they die, or 500 places to see before they disappear, right? Don't do anything about preventing them from disappearing, but actually go there before they do so you can say to your friend, not only have you not been there, but you never can go there because it's gone. And it actually has a name now. It's being marketed as last chance tourism. What the hell do we think is going to cause people to want to take a more positive view about the world if this is what we have to say? And simply the fates put this person's truck in front of Pamela's and my house when we moved to Portland to let me know that when we left New York, we weren't leaving depression. This was the license plate on the truck parked in front of our house when we moved in. Imagine that. Getting up every morning, going out to your truck, no hope. From what well source, from what wellspring of positive action can you get if this is the way you view about the world, and my people view this world this way? And by the way, after the Trump election, my people are now saying, you think I was depressed before, now I'm really depressed. as if that is going to affect any change. So my argument to you is that in my field and for supporters of conservation and people who want to behave in responsible ways on this earth, that we must engage with the synthetic biology community across the full range of things that matter to us. And that will be stopping some of them, and it'll be using some, and it'll be modifying others. And if we do that, then we are going to have to accept the fact that these new technologies are going to force us in a variety of really uncomfortable ways to face conflicting objectives, conflicting values, the datedness of our approach, and particularly the unknowns of the future. We simply don't know what is going to happen if we use or if we don't use the technologies. So my question to you here is, what do you think about synthetic biology and conservation in a changing world, right? Because this is a world in which increasingly we're having to admit that values are structuring a lot of the actions that we take. We never used to want to say that, now we have to. Expertise is now devalued. Oh, shoot, I'm an expert on climate. I read the internet. Post-fact, all perhaps overused already, but in fact we're seeing that in the science world. Oh, come on, those aren't data. And then a mixed distrust and reliance on technology. Right, I hate that, I don't like that, that's high tech, but I'm going to Google it on my cell phone to see what the impacts are. And this being a library, I particularly wanted to bring this to your attention is the kind of change that we're looking at. We all know, if you haven't read, it's well worth reading Moby Dick, but you perhaps don't know that there's now an emoji version of Moby Dick called Emoji Dick. And so there's the first line, the very famous first line, call me Ishmael, and there it is in emojis. What is that? How do you think of that? But that is a creature that is living in this world that we're now facing. And also in a library, it's important to talk about literature. So I've given versions of this, talked to people about this over the last several years. What is really interesting is people's responses very frequently are framed by either Frankenstein or Jurassic Park. I say, haven't you seen Jurassic Park? How can you possibly be in favor of this? Or you're just trying to create Franken-organisms or Franken-foods. So that's the language that's used. Now, so what's really interesting about those two things is those are both works of fiction, right? So you have the intrusion of works of fiction into this really complicated, contorted way affecting the way people want to talk about the world in which they actually are living. So just winding this up, I suggest that we must own the imperative to shape this disruption curve that I'm talking to you about and to embrace this hybrid nature and to ride the risk. So I love this quote. Technologists say that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So I'm here to tell you that this future is here and it's going to be distributed more into your lives. So an educated public is vital to decide if these technologies are going to be given what is called a social license to operate. So you now know about this, and it's really important that you form your positions on this and that you take an active role in either rejecting or embracing or critical or whatever it is you want to do, because it's riding at us. It's coming on that Concord coach line bus from Boston, and it's going to be found across the entire range of your lives. Thank you very much. The best question gets a piece of kale. So, please.
I Googled synthetic biology last night, and I didn't get any of this. Well, I got some of it, but I didn't get this perspective.
No.
What should I have searched for?
You won't.
How can we pursue this synthetic biology conservation?
I can give you 4 or 5 articles that you could read that we've been involved in writing. It's an intersection that's a dynamic wave front right now, and you won't find it represented very broadly. You'll find a lot on de-extinction of species. The journalists just love it. But a serious consideration of it, I only know of these handful of things that I'm happy to share with you.
This is really emerging.
Oh yeah. And you know, the conservation community, in my opinion, has been looking out the back window of the school bus through its entire life and worrying about, and then we get so, you know, when a new technology hits us, we go, what? How come nobody told me? Well, I'm here to say this is going to hit us already, and we need to start looking out the front side of the bus. Right.
Aside from unintended consequence, doesn't democratization aid those who intend harm?
No, only if the people, through a democratic process, are willing to let that harm take place. So, you know, you can take the pessimistic view about the way change happens in the world, and it has happened in very negative ways in many places, or you can take a positive view about it, which has also happened in many ways, and I think both of those go on often at the same time with one another. But what I'm hoping is that through this process of talking to people about it, it won't be a surprise. At least it won't be a surprise.
Well, I think maybe what you're referring to is something I read in Time magazine sometime last year, I don't remember, talking about CRISPR and saying that I forget if it was the Joint Chiefs or some kind of risk assessment group with the government has put it on there as one of the biggest risks that we face because of biological warfare and how simple it would be. So that would be the democratization.
Yeah, it
seems like that is a big potential.
Right. And it's been classified as what they call a dual-use technology, along with nuclear power, for example. These are things that can be used for harm or used for good. And DARPA, which is the Defense Research Organization, has just launched a competition to create technologies and teams to do cleanup after the escape of gene drives. So there's a clear understanding of the potential negative downsides of this, and that's why I call it a social license to operate, because it's up to us, at least in a country like this, to have a say in whether we want to see these things develop and how, and the safeguards.
But I don't think it knows any real borders either.
Absolutely.
Given the maps that you've shown and how easily things can transfer from one country to another.
That's right. And my point about the iGEM competition is those borders are also down in time. That is, it's the 15, 16, 17-year-olds. We have a 28-year-old for whom the computer, he solved my computer problem starting here. It's just a natural thing. Pamela and I weren't raised that way. So we have a set of young people who are going to enter the world as voting people who are going to say, what do you mean? Of course we do this.
And do you think that the Gates Foundation with their C4 rice will be learned from the Green Revolution?
I suspect there's a lot of learning from the Green Revolution. And some of the big objections to this, some of these particularly agricultural technologies, is that they'll be held privately. And that is used as a justification why people are not in favor of it. The important exception is golden rice. You may know this. Many children that eat mostly rice when they're young get vitamin A deficiency, and it causes blindness, infantile blindness. And they found a way to remove, and I don't remember from what organism, the genetic sequence to make vitamin A and insert it into the rice genome. And so the rice that's produced provides vitamin A to kids. And that is systematically, those experimental fields have been destroyed by advocates who are against genetically modified organisms and say it's all about large companies trying to make profits. Only there are no patents on golden rice. It's held in the public interest. So that's not a reason. You may have other reasons why you don't like it, but that's not it.
Are there little small things we can do as we talk to people or pay attention to an article, a magazine maybe that features information, or an organization that we can follow, a blog, anything like that might be kind of condensing information, because it seems like you have a lot of information from all over.
So the short answer is no. No, not hardly. And the issue is that you get a lot of if you Google this stuff, you'll rapidly find a set of extremely adept communicators and bloggers who are virulently anti all of this technology.
Right.
And there's a substantial community out there, and they're very vocal and they're very effective at communicating. So it's easy to find all the negative stuff. And the most positive stuff tends to come from the companies that are promoting products. So it's this kind of washing in-between zone that I'm living in now. But certainly, you know, if we have a way to, I don't know how we communicate with each other, but I could certainly put a dozen, 8 to a dozen sources that people could go to. I was trying to find the slide. There's a group called Revive and Restore that's very effective in this area, that are pro these technologies, that are doing a bunch of these. So if you're looking for some of the more conservation applications, direct conservation applications, Revive and Restore, they're based out of Sausalito in California, would be a place to go. Yes?
Are the things you're most excited about food production and medicines and those kinds of things for feeding population growth? Or what else are the things that excite you most about this?
Well, so if I were wealthy and could invest in a lot in one of these areas, it would be this degraded land. I mean, tell me one other way to get 10% of the Earth's terrestrial surface back into production for both food and nature. 10% of the Earth's surface, more or less. That's extraordinary.
I was struck that map suggested that half the Midwest was out of.
I know, that's why so that map was meant to be a kind of visual thing. There actually is no agreed upon definition for what degraded means. And if you care, I can send you a piece where somebody actually used all the different definitions and then mapped the Earth according to those. And so it's a range from like 3.5% to 12%, depending on how you define it. So fair enough, it's a good point though.